Hello and welcome to this lecture in Educational Psychology. This is Module 9. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie. Now we'll be taking a look today at educational strategies. Now, although educational strategies differ in their details, they each encourage particular forms of learning and thinking. The forms have distinctive educational purposes, even though they sometimes will overlap, in the sense that one form may contribute to success with another form. Now consider three somewhat complex forms of thinking that are commonly pursued in classroom learning. Think in terms of critical thinking, or creative thinking, and then finally problem solving. Now, in critical thinking, this is something that requires the skill of analyzing the reliability and validity of information, as well as the attitude or disposition to do so. The skill and attitude may be displayed with regard to a particular subject matter or topic, but in principle, it can occur in any realm of knowledge. A critical thinker does not necessarily have a negative attitude in the everyday sense of constantly criticizing someone or something. Instead, the person can be thought of as being astute. The critical thinker asks key questions, evaluates the evidence for ideas, reasons for problems both logically and objectively, and expresses ideas and conclusions clearly and precisely. And last but not least, the critical thinker can apply these habits of mind in more than one realm of life or knowledge. Now, with such a broad definition, it's not surprising that educators have suggested a variety of specific cognitive skills are contributing to critical thinking. Now, for example, one study suggests that the researcher found how critical thinking can be reflected in regards to a published article that was stimulated by annotation, that is, writing questions and comments in the margins of the article. Now, in this study, students were initially instructed in ways of annotating reading materials, and later, when the students completed additional readings for assignments, it was found that some students, in fact, used their annotation skills much more than others. Some simply underline passages, for example, with a highlighting pen. When essays written about the readings were later analyzed, the ones written by the annotators were found to be more well-reasoned, more critically astute than the essays written by the other students. So that's just an example of something that can happen. Now, in another research into how to stimulate critical thinking, they looked at how oral discussion is involved. And they involved oral discussion of personal issues or dilemmas. And in this study, students were asked to verbally describe a recent personal incident that disturbed them. The classmates then discussed the incident together in order to identify the precise reasons why the incident was disturbing, as well as the assumptions that the student made in describing the incident. And the original student, the one who had first told the story, then used the results of the group discussion to frame a topic for a research essay. In one story of a troubling incident, a student told of a time when a store clerk had snubbed or rejected the student during a recent shopping errand. Through discussion, classmates decided that an assumption underlying the student's disturbance was the student's suspicion that the student had been a victim of racial profiling based on the student's skin color. The student then used this idea as the basis for a research essay on the topic of racial profiling in retail stores. Now, the oral discussion had stimulated critical thinking in the student and the classmates, but it also relied on their prior critical thinking skills at the same time. Now, notice that in both of these research studies, as in others like them, what made the thinking critical was students' use of something called metacognition. And that is the strategies for thinking about thinking and for monitoring the success and quality of one's own thinking. When students acquire experience in building their own knowledge, they also become skilled both at knowing how to learn and at knowing whether they have learned something well. These are two defining qualities of metacognition, but they are part of critical thinking as well. In fostering critical thinking, a teacher is really fostering a student's ability to construct and control their own thinking and to avoid being controlled by ideas unreflectively. How best to teach critical thinking still remains a debate. One of the issues is whether to infuse critical skills into existing courses or to teach them through separate freestanding courses. The first approach has the potential advantage of integrating critical thinking into a student's entire education, but it risks diluting students' understanding and use of critical thinking simply because critical thinking takes on a different form in each learning context. Its details and its appearance vary from course to course and teacher to teacher. The freestanding approach has the opposite qualities. It stands a better chance of being understood clearly and coherently, but at the cost of obscuring how it is related to other courses, tasks, and dilemmas. And this dilemma is the issue of transfer within the learning process. Unfortunately, research to compare the different strategies for teaching critical thinking does not settle the matter. The research suggests simply that either infusion or freestanding approaches can work as long as it is implemented thoroughly and teachers are committed to the value of critical thinking. Now, a related issue about teaching critical thinking is about deciding who needs to learn critical thinking skills the most. Should it be all students or simply some of the students? And that's part of the question. And then we go on to creative thinking. Creative thinking is the ability to make or do something new that is also useful or valued by others. The something can be an object like an essay or a painting, a skill like playing an instrument, or an action like using a familiar tool in a new way. To be creative, the object, skill, or action cannot simply be bizarre or strange. It cannot be new without also being useful or valued, and not simply be the result of accident. If a person types letters at random that form a poem by chance, the result may be beautiful, but it would not be creative in the sense of creative thinking. Now, viewed this way, creativity includes a wide range of human experience that many people, if not everyone, has had at some time or another experienced. The experience is not restricted to a few geniuses, nor exclusive to specific fields or activities of art or composing music. Especially important for teachers are two facts. The first is that an important form of creativity is creative thinking. The generation of ideas that are new as well as useful, productive, and appropriate. The second is that creative thinking can be stimulated by the teacher's efforts. Teachers can, for example, encourage students' divergent thinking, ideas that are open-ended and that lead in many directions. Divergent thinking is stimulated by open-ended questions, questions with many possible answers. Like, how many uses can you think of for a cup? Or, what is the most unusual use you can think of for a shoe? Now, the answers to these questions depends partly on having already acquired knowledge about the objects. And in this sense, divergent thinking depends partly on its counter, convergent thinking, which is focused, logical reasoning about ideas and experiences that lead to specific answers. And up to a point then, developing students' convergent thinking, as schoolwork often does, by its emphasis on mastery of content, facilitates a student's divergent thinking indirectly, and hence also their creativity. But, carried to extremes, excessive emphasis on convergent thinking can discourage creativity. So whether in school or outside of school, creativity should be engaged in and should be explored to be part of the useful process of creating new ways of thinking and understanding the world. And this might be working together in teams, or it may be working individually. And this brings us now to problem solving. Now, somewhat less open-ended than creative thinking is problem solving, the analysis and solution of tasks or situations that are complex or ambiguous and that pose difficulties or obstacles of some kind. Problem solving is needed, for example, when a physician analyzes a chest x-ray. A photograph of the chest is far from clear and requires skill, experience, and resourcefulness to decide which foggy-looking blobs to ignore and which to interpret as real physical structures and therefore real medical concerns. Problem solving is also needed when a grocery store manager has to decide how to improve the sales of a product. Should the manager put on a sale to lower prices and increase publicity? What should the manager do? Problem solving happens in classrooms when when teachers present tasks or challenges that are deliberately complex and for which finding a solution is not straightforward or obvious. And I hope you will notice that some of your assignments for this course are somewhat like that. It's about you developing your skill for problem solving. Now, the responses of students to such problems, as well as the strategies for assisting them, show the key features of problem solving. Now, let's use this as a bit of an example. Now, a teacher gave these instructions. As you see on the slide, can you connect all the dots below using only 4 straight lines? And she drew a pattern just like what we have here on the slide. The problem itself and the procedure for solving it seemed very clear. Simply experiment with different arrangements of 4 lines. But 2 volunteers tried doing it on the board. Both were unsuccessful. Several others worked at their seats, but also without success. And then finally, someone abandons the basic rules of thinking that you need to be inside the box. As soon as you think outside the box and extend the lines, then everything seems to work. And so following the rules is a great way of solving the problem. Now, when it comes to common obstacles to solve problems, there are 2 problems that sometimes happen during problem solving. One of these is functional fixedness, a tendency to regard the functions of objects and ideas as fixed. Now, over time, we get so used to one particular purpose for an object that we overlook other uses. We may think of a dictionary, for example, as necessarily something to verify spelling words or to find definitions, but it can also function as a gift or a doorstop or a footstool. For students working on the 9-dot matrix that we just talked about, the notion of drawing a line was also initially fixed. They assumed that to be connecting dots but not extending lines beyond the dots was part of the issue, and their minds were fixed. Functional fixedness sometimes is also called a response set, the tendency for a person to frame or think about a problem in a series of predictable ways that they've solved previous problems. Now, functional fixedness and the response set are obstacles in problem representation, the way that a person understands and organizes information provided in a problem. If information is misunderstood or used inappropriately, then mistakes are likely, if indeed the problem can be solved at all. Now, with the 9-dot matrix problem, for example, construing the instruction to draw 4 lines as meaning draw 4 lines entirely within the matrix means that the problem simply cannot be solved. However, when we allow ourselves to extend and look at the problem differently, then the problem can be solved. So there are strategies to assist in problem solving. Just as there are cognitive obstacles to problem solving, there are also general strategies to help the process be successful, regardless of the specific content of a problem. One helpful strategy is problem analysis, identifying the parts of the problem and working on each part separately. Analysis is especially useful when a problem is ill-structured. Now, consider this problem. Devise a plan to improve bicycle transportation in the city. Now, solving this problem is easier if you identify its parts or component subproblems, such as installing bicycle lanes on busy streets, educating cyclists and motorists to ride safely, fixing potholes on streets used by cyclists, revising traffic laws that interfere with cycling. Each separate sub-problem is more manageable than the original general problem. The solution of each sub-problem contributes to the solution of the whole, though of course it's not equivalent to a whole strategy. Now, another helpful strategy is working backward from a final solution to the originally stated problem. And this approach is especially helpful when a problem is well structured, but also has elements that are distracting or misleading when approached in a forward normal direction. A third helpful strategy is analogical thinking, using knowledge or experiences with similar features or structures to help solve the problem at hand. In devising a plan to improve bicycling in the city, for example, an analogy of cars with bicycles is helpful in thinking of solutions. Improving conditions for both vehicles requires many of the same measures: improving roads, educating drivers, all those things. Even solving simpler, more basic problems is helped by considering analogies. Now, a first grade student can partially decode unfamiliar printed words by analogy to words that the student has already learned. Now, if a child cannot yet read the word screen, for example, the student can note that part of this word looks similar to words that the student already knows, such as seen or green. And from this observation can derive clues about how to read the word screen. Teachers can assist this process, as you might expect, by suggesting reasonable, helpful analogies for students to consider. And all of this is part and parcel of helping the student to develop the skills essential for learning. Now, broad instructional strategies are also helpful for stimulating complex thinking. And because the forms of thinking, critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving are broad, the general approaches that teachers always use are inevitably helpful. And now there's lots of different strategies that can be used. When we think in terms of teacher-directed instruction, this includes any strategies initiated and guided primarily by the teacher. Now, a classical example is lecturing, simply telling or explaining important information to the students. And we combine this with assigned readings from the text. But teacher-directed instruction also includes strategies that involve more active responses from students, such as encouraging students to elaborate on new knowledge or explain how new information relates to prior knowledge. Now, whatever their form, teacher-directed instructional methods normally include the organizing of information on behalf of students, even if teachers also expect students to organize it further on their own. Sometimes, therefore, teacher-directed methods are thought of as transmitting knowledge from teacher to student as clearly and efficiently as possible, even if they also require mental work on the part of the student. Now, lectures and readings are traditional staples of educators, particularly with older students, like being in university. Now, at their best, they pre-organize information so that, in theory at least, the student only has to remember what was said in the lecture or written in the text in order to begin to understand the problem. There are also advanced organizers. In spite of the problems of directed instruction, there are strategies for making lectures and readings effective. A teacher can be especially careful about organizing information for students, and the student can turn part of the mental work over to the students themselves. Now, an example of this is the approach of the use of advanced organizers, where there's brief overviews or introductions to new material before the material itself is presented. Now, textbook authors will often do this, where they'll have a quick introduction and a summary at the end. All of that helps to organize for the student. Then there's recalling and relating prior knowledge. Another strategy for improving teacher-directed instruction is to encourage students to relate the new material to prior familiar knowledge, and also to make it meaningful. Of course, looking for different ways of elaborating the new information is also important. Inferring ideas and finding relationships and playing with the concepts all deepens the encoding process and helps to transform from short-term and working memory into long-term memory. And then having the student also engage in organizing new information. Now, a common way is to simply ask students to outline the information that they've read in the text or heard in the lecture. And outlining works especially well when the information is already organized somewhat hierarchically into a series of main topics. And then the student can break it down into subtopics and subpoints. And outlining is a basic form and strategy for taking notes. It helps to organize the information. And then, of course, you can create concept maps. And concept maps help to find connections or diagrams between different ideas. And that those connections can then be used as retrieval cues later on to help to bring and access the information that has already been presented. Now, of course, there are also student-centered models of learning. And here we see a shift in responsibility for directing and organizing learning from the teacher to the student. Being student-centered does not mean, however, that the teacher has to give up organization or leadership responsibilities completely. It only means a relative shift in the teacher's role toward one with more emphasis on guiding students' self-chosen directions. No matter how much a teacher structures or directs learning, the student still have to take responsibility for working and expending effort to comprehend new material. Now, by the same token, student-centered models of learning do not mean handing over all organizational work of instruction to the students. The teacher is still the most knowledgeable member of the class and still has both the opportunity and responsibility to guide learning in directions that are productive. And as you might expect, therefore, teacher-directed and student-centered approaches to instruction may overlap in practice. And there's different ways and strategies that are commonly used in student-centered learning. The first is an independent study. The second is self-reflection. In an independent study, a student works alone a good deal of the time. They're going to consult with the teacher, but they're going to focus in on a topic of personal interest. However, the opposite might be true when the teacher assigns the topic. Either way, the student will need some guidance, some support, and some help from the teacher. But the onus is still upon the student to explore and discover. And similarly, self-reflection refers to thinking about beliefs and experiences in order to clarify their personal meaning and their importance. And so here you would look at in terms of diaries and logs and learning and reading and retelling of stories that impact a student's life and creating concept maps that connect all of these things together. The important thing here is that there's personal meaning in the learning, and that helps to make this a very rich kind of learning. Now, another type of student-centered model for learning is inquiry learning. And inquiry learning stands the usual advice about expository lecture style teaching and turns that idea on its head. Instead of presenting well-organized information to students, the teacher, and sometimes a fellow student, poses a thoughtful question intended to stimulate discussion and investigation by students. Now, this approach has been described and used and discussed by educators literally for decades. This is the inquiry method. It's been talked about as the discovery learning. It's talked about as progressive education. But for our case, we're just going to talk about it as inquiry learning. And the idea here is that you start with something that is important and valuable that is brought up by the peer group, and the students will explore it. And they will construct and organize and learn and find how it impacts them. And so that can be very valuable and help them to engage in the constructive process of developing their own knowledge. And then comes cooperative learning. And even though inquiry-oriented discussion and investigation benefits when it involves a teacher, it can also be useful for students to work together somewhat independently, relying on a teacher's guidance only indirectly. Working with peers is a major feature of cooperative learning, sometimes called collaborative learning. And in this approach, students work on a task in groups and often are rewarded either partially or completely for the success of the group as a whole. Now, aspects of collaborative learning have been part of education for a long time, but when you formalize it, it can be a very powerful process for helping the student to gain ownership of learning. Now, of course, you need to be mindful of the whole issue of freeloading or over-specialization within this kind of process. And so it's always important to have a peer input and peer evaluation as part of the process to ensure that people are really engaged in the process and that there's encouragement of each other. Now, my point for this lecture is this. You have lots of choices, lots of different instructional strategies that you can use in engaging in the learning process, and the extent to which ideas or skills need to be organized by you to be understood by students, and the extent to which students need to take responsibility for directing their own learning is fluid, depending upon your goals, the capability of your students, how much you can motivate your students. But there are lots of strategies. Now, if you need to organize complex information so that students do not become confused by it, there are effective ways of doing so. If you want students to take as much initiative as possible in organizing their own learning, this too can be done. The essential point here is that you can choose to influence how you teach and what you teach and what combination of skills and complex thinking you wish to nurture within your students. And this is part of the joy of being a teacher. I'll see you next week.